Hello, today is April 24th, 2024. The interviewee is Philip Orenstein. I'm Andriette Redman. We are in Highland Park, New Jersey, USA, and our language will be English. Hello, we're here with Philip Orenstein. Where were you born and when?
I was born in Paris, in the 11th arrondissement of Paris, and this was December 22nd, 1938.
And what was your first language?
French.
And what was your
My first language was ba 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 ba. Ba.
and your identity was like religious identity or
Um, like you're asking how a baby identifies.
or your family?
My family, my mother was born in France. Actually, she was born in the same hospital I was. Like where we were living in the 11th arrondissement was where my family first came to France and lived in that place. Because my family, my grandfather's family were furniture makers in Europe. And they came to the furniture district of Paris, which was the 11th arrondissement. And the hospital, Saint Antoine Hospital, was right in the furniture district. It still is. So
And
my mother and I and my brother, I have a brother. The name is Steve, and he was born 4 years before I was.
and when was your mother and where was she born? And same with your father and your
Yeah.
brother.
My mother was born in 1911 in Paris, and she was born. She was born 1911, and my father was born in 1909 in Poland. Ozorów was the town near Warsaw, not far from Warsaw, and he was born 1909.
And did you have relatives in the area where you lived?
Oh yes, I mean, like before the war, I don't have a lot of memories of the family, but I know the family, uncles and aunts, all lived in that area. All lived. Uh, First of all, it was mainly a Jewish area, the 11th arrondissement, and it was near the Bastille, so that was near another Jewish area. So a lot of relatives were all living there pretty much out of necessity and also because of their work.
How long were they there? For decades or centuries or?
Well, my family first, there was one uncle that came first, and he came to France, and he immediately enrolled in the army, the French army. And he fought in the Gulf and Tonkin War in 1874. And so after he came, the rest of the family came, mostly from my mother's family. My father's family came also, but I have less information about them.
And both sides came from Poland?
Um, I think my son did some research on that. I think my grandfather came from Bialystok, and my grandmother's family came from the area of Vitebsk, Belarus, really in that area, and she. Her family came later, but in the 90s.
And what brought them there to Paris area or?
Like I said, my father came, but that's a different
We'd love
story.
to hear that story. Yeah.
Yes, you will. Um, he, they came, I think, because of economic and also probably pogroms or whatever it was. But the family actually was pretty wealthy when they came. Uh, they had been business people for a long time in Vitebsk, and when they came here, they were expecting to be, successful business people. But then they realized that they were now immigrants and they had to go to work. So the reason I'm telling you that is that there's a little story about different attitudes between my grandfather's family and my grandmother's family, and my grandfather and grandmother met in Paris in school, in elementary school. I don't know if you've ever been in Paris. Rue des Rosiers, there's a school there where a lot of the children are rounded up. So that's where my grandmother and grandfather met. They at the time that was the school for that area, for that district. Even though it's in Rue des Rosiers and they were living in the 11th, it was the school. So my grandfather was 11. I think my grandmother was 6, but they didn't marry then.
And did they come from different backgrounds or
Yeah,
similar?
my grandfather's background was mostly tradespeople. Like people work with their hands. And my grandmother's family were business people, and they had a mill at one time in Vitebsk, so they were pretty well off, and that was a big shock for them to come to France and be immigrants.
Were they religious?
I don't know. Certainly, by the time I knew them, they weren't. Um, my grandfather, I don't think was, and my mother was not raised, especially Jewish, so religious. So that's the story there.
And what about your other grandparents?
When my father left Poland, my other grandparents stayed there, and just a few years ago, Mitchell did some research and he found that my grandparents were killed in Treblinka.
Sorry.
And much of my father's family was also, like, he had something like 9 siblings. Only 3 of them survived the war. And my father and his sister were there before the war, were left before the war. And one sister who was younger managed to make it through. It's also another story. But she made it through, and she came to live with us in Paris after the war with her husband.
What's her story briefly?
Briefly, historically, she hid the fact that she was Jewish, and she was young. She was 16, and she was blonde, and she went to work in Germany in a place, and had to make believe that she was Catholic, but she knew nothing about it. So she set up in that factory where she was working. She set up a group that would do the prayers every day before going to bed. And so they asked her to do it first, and she's, oh no, I'm too shy. And then so they all did it, and by the time they all did it, she learned how to do it, and she survived the war that way. And her husband was in the Polish army and survived the war in Russia and in the Polish army. So they all both had stories. Like all these stories, the people who survive that story, my grandparents, I never met them. I didn't know.
And what about your dad? What was his story?
Well, my dad's story is is pretty interesting. My grandfather was a cattle dealer in the First World War. He had been a butcher before, and then he became a cattle dealer and supplied the Russian army with cattle. And he couldn't buy land in Poland, and so he put all his money was in Russian ruble, and he had a closet full of Russian ruble that all of a sudden, after 1917, became paper. So after the First World War in 1920, my father was helping him buy cattle. Um, he was the oldest child. He was sort of precocious in many ways, and his father would send him to the Polish farmers to buy a cow. Buy a cow so he could be butchered, and he sent my father, who was 10, maybe 11, to go and buy the cow. Estimate how much the cow weighed, but he couldn't handle the money, so he sent somebody with him to handle the money. So my father would say, "This weighs this much," and they made a deal, and he bought the cow, and the person who went with him, gave him the money. So then at one time, like his father was very strict. And one time he went to buy a cattle, and they had some money. Instead of bringing back the change, the money, he went and bought himself a suit. And so he came back with a suit, and his father, didn't say anything. But anyway, in 1921, my father was 12, and he had an argument and a fight with some Polish boys, and he felt at a certain point that there was no future for him in Poland. So he decided to leave Poland. He got some money from uncles who lived in the U.S. I think they sent him the equivalent maybe of $100, and he decided he would leave. He just left his family and he paid somebody to take him across the border to Czechoslovakia. Then he went from Czechoslovakia to Germany, and I guess paid somebody else to go across Germany. And he was on the train to Germany, and he arrived in Frankfurt. And in Frankfurt, somebody told him that there was somebody in Frankfurt that would take care of orphan Jewish children. So he went there, and the man who ran the place knew his family in Poland. So he said, "What are you doing here? Why don't you go back?" And my father says, "No, I'm not going back. I'm going to France." So he got to stay for a while there, and then the man says, "Okay, if you're going to France, I'll pay you to I'll give you some money so you can pay somebody to go across." So he went to the border of Germany and Belgium, and the coyote didn't show up. So there he was waiting at the border of Belgium and Germany, and then he would go immediately to the Jewish areas because he could speak Yiddish. And he met a man, and the man told him, "Look," he says, "you see that bar over there? If you go in front of the bar, it's Germany. But if you go out the back, it's Belgium." So that's how my father got to Belgium. And then he took a train. He was going to Brussels, and he was worried about, he didn't speak French. He didn't speak, he just spoke Yiddish, maybe a little German. So he got to Belgium, and he went to the Jewish quarters in Belgium. And then when people found out, he went to eat in a restaurant. When people found out he was 12 and he was running away from Poland, they were horrified. So he says, "No," I'm going to France. So he left Belgium. I don't know how he got over to France. He said he got on a train, and since he was a kid, like nobody really paid attention, then he got to Paris, and he didn't know anyone in Paris. He just had money, and he rented a room, and he got a job with an upholsterer. He was only 12, so he wasn't really allowed to work, but in the Jewish quarter he did. And then after a while, he knew he had a relative in Paris, but he didn't know where he was or what his name was. Or he knew his name, but he didn't know where he lived or where he was. So every time he kept going to a restaurant to eat, he would ask about this man, and no one knew this. But he went to one restaurant, and actually they knew him, and then he had family now in France. But he kept working. He kept living by himself, and until 1930. Like from 1921 to 1931, probably.
Do you know if he had a bar mitzvah?
No, he didn't.
And did he celebrate any holidays there with the family, or?
I guess so. I knew him. I didn't know him at that time, and I knew him after the war. And after the war, he had no interest. And in Poland, he had learned. He had gone to Reda and graduated till ninth grade. He knew the religion all, very well. And actually, when he got older, he was like the expert on the religion. But he never he sent us to Hebrew school when we came to the U.S. But he wasn't really that forceful about it. So at a certain point, they came to him. The rabbi came to him and asked him to tutor him and pay him to tutor him. My father didn't want to pay to tutor him, so I thought, doesn't care. What do I care? So I didn't get bar mitzvah either, and neither did my brother. And for the longest time, my father went to shul, and only because of the uncles. That's another story. How my father came to the U.S. But that's and he met my mother because he was working in a shop as a presser, in a shop owned by my mother's sister's husband. And he wasn't married at that time. My mother wasn't married at that time. So they, were interested in introducing them and all that. So eventually they got married.
What does a presser do?
See, in men's clothing, especially custom-made clothing, when they do the sewing, you have to open the seams and press them, so in men's clothing, the pressing is very important. And my father used to say that when he pressed a suit, the customer could just walk into it. And he was like a craftsman, and he was in demand. He worked in many shops as a presser. So he was, he was able to do it, and he was paid well, I guess, for doing that. But it was craftsman's salary. It wasn't, professional salary.
And how did he meet your mother? Like, what was she up to?
Well, her sister's husband owned the shop, and I guess from time to time my mother would come and sit in the shop with her sister. My mother was born in 1909, and what I recently realized is that my mother also was born 4 years after, or a couple of years after my grandfather went to fight in the war. So she didn't have her father until she was 8. So when he came back, she, it was the time where the jazz started coming into France and Paris after the war. The American soldiers introduced jazz to Paris. So my mother, was interested in the Charleston. They were all playing the Charleston, and she asked my grandfather to get her a mandolin, so she could play the Charleston. So she did that. She did that for a while. Then after a while, the uh, the the story is that Heifetz was in Paris, and he was well known. So my mother decided that she wanted to learn the violin. So my grandfather was very doting on her, bought her a violin, and got her somebody to teach her. So she was about 8. So she had a teacher, and about a year after the teacher came to my grandmother, says, "I can't teach her anymore. You have to get a first prize violin teacher, from the conservatory." I mean, my mother was a prodigy, and she became a violinist. And when she met my father, she was a violinist, and it was during silent movie era, and she had a little band in one of the movies, and would play in the movies. But she also was played in an orchestra. So she was really she tried to get into the Paris Conservatory as a prodigy, but she was too old by that time. By the time she started at 8 or 9, most prodigies were already playing fully. But she earned a living playing the violin.
And what age did she get married?
It must have been in her 20s, because I think she got married in 31 or 32.
Did she continue with her violin career?
No. The reason is my father. If you're playing the violin in the movie or other places, it's usually in the evening, And my father didn't want her to go out at night, to play the violin. And she really was kind of enamored with my father. So, she did it, and then she stopped playing. And I never heard her play. I mean, after the war, she wouldn't play anymore. I mean, it was all... At one time I heard her, is that this was in Lakewood at the farm. It was like maybe for Passover or some holiday. My brother and his wife and myself, and my brother was trying to learn to play the violin, so he brought his music and he brought the violin, and all the kids would ask her. They knew that my mother played the violin, and we asked her to play, and she wouldn't. She says, I haven't played, for 20 years, 30 years, So then finally we forced her to play. So she got my brother's book, she opened it up, she took the violin, tuned it, and then went through the whole thing like like lightning. And at a certain point she said, "Oh, my fingers are not working." So that's the story of the violin. But she was special in that way. Yeah. And then that's another story about coming to America. When she came to America, she had to work as a seamstress, and although during the war, I think part of the thing that saved her is that she worked as a seamstress, sewing German coats, German uniforms. So there was a certain safety in having that position, because they needed overcoats because of Russia, because they were all working in Russia and had no winter clothing. And my uncle, who was a furrier, was also saved, even though his son wasn't. He, they needed fur. I mean, they needed coats, fur coats to go to Russia, or to be in Russia. So I think that's why he managed to survive, because he wasn't a Frenchman. He was definitely an immigrant, and his son was French. And I think, in retrospect, I think that's what did it. So there are different scenarios to surviving, and at that time in France. And
Can you tell us more about what happened to your parents as time moved on?
the I guess my mother didn't work. She had children pretty soon after she got married. My brother was born in 1934. I was born in 1938. By 1939, my father was joining the army. And in 1940, he was taken prisoner. And 1945, he came back.
And where was he taken prisoner? Do you know any stories?
Yeah. He was in that situation they called the phony war. The phony war was that in 1939, when the Germans attacked Poland, France and England declared war, but they didn't go anywhere. They didn't go to Poland. They didn't go anywhere. They were stationed on the Belgium border, and waiting there. Like they started in September 39, and they sat there. And meanwhile, Poland was getting invaded, and they basically didn't do very much with their infantry, and until May, when May of 1940. So from 1939 September to May, nothing was happening. My father said that they would look across the river on the Meuse, and they would take pot shots at each other. They saw the Germans, they'd take pot shots once in a while. But then in May, the whole thing blasted through, and the part of the Meuse that he was in was not in the area that they were breaking through into France. So what the German army did was break into France and try to go right into Dieppe, right across the top of France. And that's what happens with Dunkirk. The British and the French that were caught in that were escaping through Dunkirk, and they were stuck there in Dunkirk. But then the German army just went down and captured Paris. I mean, they went across in May. Now, this is not what I remember because I was a kid. But I tried to piece together the story, what happened to me. So in May, they captured Paris on June 12th, 1940. And my father was still at the front at the time, because he hadn't moved from his position in the Meuse. And after the Germans captured Paris, he just went back and picked them up. So in 1940, about that time, is when he was a prisoner. And they marched him from there. They marched him to Germany. That's what he did.
What was life like for you as your father was away when you were? What's your earliest memory?
My earliest my earliest memory is not what really happened. My earliest memory was in southern France. You've seen pictures of Paris being attacked, being occupied. A lot of people just went south and on the roads and things like that. I had an uncle in Paris, my father's family. My father's sister's husband was an engineer, and he was a major engineer in the electric company. Like he built dams and other things like that. He lived in Paris. He's Jewish, and um, they were living in Paris, and he went down to Lyon for his job, and in Lyon, the person he was working with, and he was an important engineer, um, said to them that the electric company was developing a new dam in central France in a place called the Mont d'Or. They were going to build a dam. So there were villages there that were empty. Um, so so he arranged that we all went down to the Mont d'Or, my mother and us and his wife and my grandparents, my mother's parents. So we were there, and we lived there for a while. But after my father was taken prisoner, my mother wasn't getting any news. She didn't even know if he was alive or where he was. So she decided to go back to Paris, which is supposedly the occupied zone. And I remember before we went back, I was in a park, and I was climbing on things, and I was walking on a bench, on top of the bench, and I fell down and sort of cut my chin, so I had to get my chin stitched up, and that's the first memory that I have at the time. And my mother and took us back, and I think her parents too went back. Her parents didn't live in Paris anymore. My grandfather was a furniture maker, and he was good furniture, and he had a shop in Paris. And he bought a house in the southern, a district, a little town outside of Paris called Fontenay-sous-Bois, and Sous-Bois meant the Bois de Vincennes, the Vincennes wood. So he had his house there, and he knew the chief of police, and he played cards with him and all the stuff like that. My mother was living, we were living in Paris, and the first thing I remember in Paris was that there was some kind of bombardment in Paris, and I don't know exactly what age I was. I'm sure I was like 3, the most. When I was in Mont d'Or, I was about 2. And then I was 3, and then we had to go down to the basement, everybody in the building. And we were living in the top floor. Paris, you've seen garrets, these little garrets on the roof. We were living in the roof. Anyway, we went down, and we spent some time there. And then when we had the old clear signal, whatever that was, we went back upstairs. My mother didn't want to go back to the 6th floor, and so we stayed with one of her friends, a woman that they were friendly with, and that woman put us in her bedroom, and and we stayed there that night for that time. Then in Paris,
Was there a story with the bedroom?
Do it.
Is there a story with that?
Yes, there's a story. The bedroom, she had this silk quilt, big silk quilt, and I sort of hid under the quilt, and to this day I still remember getting under the quilt to stop the bombs, whatever. Anyway, that was the story then. And then in Paris, before the war, I was 3, and I went to school. In Paris, the school system starts in pre-kindergarten. They call maternelle. Uh, so my brother went to elementary school, and he would walk me to the maternelle, and I would stay there. I mean, I would go to school, and we had lunch there. And after lunch, my brother came and took me back to the apartment. Um, Once I was eating lunch, and I was sitting, and my hand was there, and they put the hot pot, right on my finger, and I still have a scar. Anyway, that's what I remember about that school. Anyway,
Was it mostly Jewish kids in that area, or
that area,
mixed?
that area had a lot of Jewish kids, mostly Jewish kids, but there were also Italian, kids. But it was working class area. It still is, and there were furniture suppliers. I remember there was a marble top company that my friend was in, but not from then, from after the war.
Do you know
But
if there was anti-Semitism at the time
not
around?
not at that time. I wouldn't know. I was too young. I'm sure there was, because there was after the war. um, it was a working class neighborhood. There were a lot of Jews. Good. Most of the Jews that were rounded up in Paris were from that area. That arrondissement was devastated. Anyway, so it wasn't a wealthy area. It was working class shops and workshops, and my grandfather had a workshop on down the avenue, near closer to the Bastille. It was between Bastille and Nation. There was one street. It was called Rue du Faubourg Saint-Antoine. And Faubourg Saint-Antoine was an old town. It was like a town that became part of Paris, and it was a furniture area in the 16th century. So they supplied the furniture for the French castles and Versailles and all these things. So that area was a very well-known, very famous furniture district, even before it became part of Paris. And they even say that it's the furniture district workers that took down the Bastille, because the Bastille was just down the street. So the workers in the furniture district were the ones who attacked the Bastille. That's what I found out, more or less. So anyway, so there was a whole tradition of this. So my grandfather had a furniture making, and he made pretty fine furniture, carving, and all the stuff. Not very fancy, but middle class, upper middle class type furniture. And he gave each of his daughters, he had 3 daughters, a dining room set. And I remember the dining room set. It had carvings, and it had a marble top, and it had things on top, But he was really a fine craftsman. So that was, and relatives, when I had my aunts, and then my mother's relative.
Interesting. And how did it progress from there during the war, and what happened?
I don't know. Probably my brother knows a little more, because he was much more conscious of things. He was 4 years older than I was, and he knew a little bit more. Somehow, this was around 1942 when they were doing the roundups in Paris. Somehow, either my mother got aware of that, or maybe she got the information from my grandmother, who was still in touch with the chief of police in Fontenay. The story of France is that every Jew that was rounded up and sent to a concentration camp was because of a Frenchman. and every Jew that survived the war was because of the Frenchmen, and they never put it back together again. It's like Humpty Dumpty, you know.
And what's that story about your own? Was it your father who was friendly with somebody who, so he wouldn't get sent away? The chief wouldn't send.
My
That was your was that?
No. This
What?
was, I first met my father when he was sent back from prisoner of war camp to France. And he was sent to the Loire Valley, and they were putting him up in one of the castles, like either Amboise or Saumur. So there was a month period where the Germans wanted to decommission the Jewish North African and African soldiers and either put the Jews in concentration camps or send the Africans home or whatever they wanted. But Pétain was very, let's say, concerned about prisoners of war. He was collaborating with Germans. He had signed an armistice. They were collaborating, but he was very concerned about the soldiers, and he didn't care whether they were Jewish or North Africans or Africans. The French soldiers had to be treated according to the Geneva Conference, and Germany was not part of the Geneva Conference. But that's what they wanted them to be. And there was a standoff for about a month. Hitler wanted Pétain to shake his hand, some kind of political imagery. And Pétain would not shake hands with him until the prisoners of war were taken care of. And so there was a standoff, and Pétain even threatened to send the French Navy to England at that time. Finally, in the fall of 1940, Pétain agreed to shake hands with Hitler. Hitler came to France and visited France and went around. And this happened in a place called Montoire. And there was he was shaking hands with Pétain. There were films and there were photos. I have a couple of photos of that. And the French public was horrified. Here's Pétain, the hero of World War I, shaking hands with Hitler, the conqueror. But actually, the shaking of the hand actually guaranteed that my father would make it through the war. And he was protected in the prisoner of war camp until 1945, when he was released.
Which camp?
It was, he had a number of camps at first that I don't know about, but the final camp he went to was in Salzburg, Austria. It was called Stalag 18C. And there are still people in France now, family of soldiers and Stalag 18C, and I see them on Facebook. So anyway, I have pictures of that camp. My father in that camp. So he was okay, more or less, and he didn't really suffer until the last 1944, when they didn't really supply the camps with food and other things for about a year, But he actually made it through, and they all did, all the soldiers there. Anyway, so that's what happened with my father.
And what happened to your mother and you in the meantime?
Well, we're living in Paris, and since my mother was French and my grandfather had been, had been naturalized French, and I had been veteran of the First World War, we didn't fit on the immediate, uh, description of who's going to be rounded up. But it became clear, I guess, to my mother after a while that Paris was not the place for us. Um, she didn't want to leave her parents. At that time, I think pretty early on, my grandfather died. Um, he was diabetic, and he had um, he had to have an operation. They didn't want to make the operation because it was diabetic. Anyway, he died, so it was just my grandmother. So I don't think he wanted to leave my grandma. She wanted to leave my grandmother by herself. So since we were children of prisoners of war, I think the Red Cross placed us in that place. Why they did it, I don't know, but it must have been well known that this was a safe place to go. So my mother, at a certain point, uh, decided to send us to this town. And I guess my brother would probably know more about that. All I remember is going on a train and going there. But I didn't know what was going on before or after. The only thing I knew was I couldn't tell people that I was Jewish. That's the only thing they told me. I didn't even know what Jewish was. It took me a long time to figure it out. It wasn't until after the war that that's another story.
So just the kids would go?
Yes, my mother's husband was in prison, and my mother sent us to foster home. That's what happens here in the U.S. The father's in prison, the mother sends the kid to foster home.
And what was life like there at the Red Cross?
No, the Red Cross wasn't there. At first they placed us in one house in this town called Houdan. It's a border town to Normandy. Like the next town over is Normandy, and we were in the Ile-de-France, the part of France that used to belong to the king. So this was a border town, and there was a fortress in the town because it was. Now you sort of wonder why was there a border town here? What border are they talking about? Anyway, in the 12th century, they built this fortress, and the tower of the 12th century was still there in Houdan. It's still there, and it's the landmark of that town. So you say 12th century, it was 12th century is 1100, 1100 something. Why would they do a fortress there? In Normandy in 1066, the Duke of Normandy became the King of England. So all of a sudden, Normandy was England, and the Ile-de-France was France. So you had a border now that was England was here and France was there, and it was not until about the 1400 that it became France again. So that town became a border town, and it was an important town, and it had a pretty fine church. So they placed us first in one house, and my brother had a problem with wetting his bed, and don't tell him that. That's the one thing. Anyway, so they sent him to another house, and this was a large house, and there were about, I would say, 8 or at most 8 children, maybe more. I don't, but not more than 9 children of soldiers that were in prisoner of war camp. They were placed there, and I guess with us being children of prisoner of war camp, they had rations, because in those days you needed rations to survive. So having 9 or 8 kids with rations was an advantage. And so these people had a large house. The reason they had a large house, the house belonged to a doctor. So it was very, very imposing house, 3 floors, and more. And a large yard, very large yard. The yard was almost like a park. There were trees, there were grass, there was a river nearby. And this doctor, during the war, like France, that town was attacked in the beginning of the war when they were moving to Paris. So he decided he's going to go to Morocco. So he left for Morocco, and the people that were the caretakers of that house moved into the house and took care of these kids because they weren't wealthy, but they were able to survive better. The husband worked on the farm. He would go and work on a farm, and her wife, his wife would stay home and take care of the kids. And then she had a grown daughter who was really taking care of us, and the mother was older. The most, I think, at the time she was probably in her 60s, but people aged faster and sometimes. So we were taken care of at that time,
For how long?
My bedroom was with the older woman because I was still pretty small, and then the other kids their own room. There were many rooms in that house. You'll see later. They explain the others in the other part of the story. It was quite large, and so we moved there, and I think I asked after the war. I asked her if people in town knew that we were Jewish, and she says, "Well, there was a law that we had to register you as Jewish." So she registered us in the city hall that we were Jewish, and we registered for school. We went to school, and when we weren't at school, we weren't walking around the streets. We had this huge yard, to play, and then also there were 8 kids there, so we had a lot of friends right there. So it was really a nice place to be. Just as long as you stayed out of the street where the Germans were walking around. Now, why was this town safe? Well, first of all, the occupation in the northern part was thinly spread. It was a large area, and they needed their troops to fight wars, so they didn't want to be heavily there. So they were around, and we knew they were there, and we saw them, and all that. But they weren't an oppressive presence. At least my experience. I would walk to school. I would pass the tower, and I would. Every kid, should walk past the 12th century tower on their way to school. So anyway, so we went to school like everybody else, and then when we came back, we had a whole yard and a lot of kids to play with. It was like a recreation area. So the reason that town was safe was that the Germans were thinly spread there, and they were leaders. That town had leaders. The priest was definitely one of the leaders, and the mayor that they had elected was sort of a leftist mayor, because that region was Ile-de-France and that whole region was pretty liberal and leftist. And he had been deposed by the Vichy government. When the Vichy government came into these towns, they would set up their own lackeys as mayor, but the town knew who the mayor was, and he was still the mayor, But even though he didn't have the power of the mayor, they didn't want to have anything to do with those. So they weren't pro-German. The town was not pro-German, and the priest was a very, very powerful leader, and he made sure that no one in the town would denounce anybody, or they would be excommunicated. He told them from the pulpit that they would be excommunicated. Now in France, there were like 100 bishops all over France. Only 6 bishops supported the resistance. The others supported the Vichy. The church hierarchy was very much pro-Vichy and pro-collaboration. The priests and the nuns they took it on their own self to save Jews and save resistors. So this priest, and I guess this bishop that we didn't see, the priest was definitely supporting the resistance. And he made sure that, he more or less said, you can collaborate with Germans, sell them things or buy things, but no one denounces anybody, no one, because at a certain point during the war, they were not only the resistors, but Allied airmen would get to France, and their planes would be shot down, and then they would have to escape and go back to England. So the resistance was doing that kind of work at the time. So there were a number of British airmen and American airmen in the town, hiding for a while, and then maybe removed. But the resistance was doing that, helping that, and the priest was supporting it. The priest was concerned about deportation. He was mainly after 1943. He was mainly concerned about the French youth that had to be recruited to go work in Germany. So that was another effort that the resistance was doing. So the resistance in that area was pretty active, not in a way of killing Germans, but in a way of operating and these farm areas are wide and large. No army could really control that. They can only control it by violence, being irrationally violent. So they try to keep that down. The town tried to keep the town down from collaborating.
And did you ever see your mother during this period?
Yes, my mother would visit, and what she had to do was hitchhike, because there were no, she was living in an area in Paris. She wasn't supposed to leave her neighborhood. I mean, that was the law. So she hitchhiked 60 miles to come and visit us. Not always all the time, but like we started there in 1942, like in the summer of 42. By 43, things had developed pretty well. And so she hitchhiked and came to visit us, and went back to Paris with a sack of potatoes, over 100 pounds sack of potatoes. And she would, somebody would help her. She would go back to an area near the railroad station where the road to Paris goes, and she would hitchhike back to Paris with her sack of potato. And I'm sure along the way, she gave away a lot of potatoes, to get rides. But she did that for a while. I don't. My cousins say a number often. My cousin saw. That's another story. My cousin saw her about like in 44, like early 44. So she didn't know what was really happening before that. But she came, and a lot of the pictures that I have are pictures that she took.
Great.
Every time she came, she took pictures.
And about your life in that area, do you remember like anything about the food or
Yeah, I
any
remember the
toys
food.
or games or anything? Yeah.
The games, I'll tell you about the game. The food. Try to imagine a 3-year-old or 4-year-old or maybe 5-year-old having to eat soup, rutabaga soup, or salsify soup, or pumpkin soup. Every time dinner was served, it was like a nightmare for me. I mean, I would be punished, and like I would eat the stew, but I couldn't eat it, and then they would the rest of my meal in the soup, and I took that. But it was good because other people weren't eating, and here we had potatoes, and we had things. We were living in the farm area. The husband worked in a farm, so we were getting milk and we were getting eggs, and so it was advantageous. If we were living in Paris, we wouldn't have all these things. So it was good to be there. But anyway, should we take a break?
Sure. Yeah, and when just about the games. The games.
The games. Well, we were all in the yard, playing games in the yard. And the game I remember is that we used to collect snails. There were a lot of snails, and they were all different colors. Little snails, tiny little snails, different colors. So we'd collect the snails, and we'd find a flat stone, and we'd put all the snails in a row like that, and we would wait until they started racing. We were racing snails. So we're waiting, and then one of them comes out, and then the other one, they're all different colors. One of them comes out, and he starts moving, and then he moves over there. Another one moved up. We're just saying that. But we'd find, things to fool around with. And I don't know. They were boys and girls. You can see in the photos that I have, and I guess they each did their own things. The yard was large, and then we had the basse-cour, what they call, where we had rabbits and chickens. So we'd visit chickens and the rabbits, and there were plenty of things to do in this yard.
Did you go to school there?
Oh, yeah.
Was it in the building itself, or was you walked to school, did you say?
Yeah, I walked to school. It was about at least half a mile to school. The school was on the outside of town, and we had to walk past the tower, and then we had to walk past the church, and then a long avenue, and then there was the school. And the school, yeah, I have a lot of stories about it.
Oh, good. We'll talk about that. Well, let's take a little break and we'll come back.
No.
Okay, we're back from a break. And so we were talking about your life in the little town and living with several other children. And what else can you tell us about that? Like, you mentioned discipline. What would happen there?
The going to school was interesting to me because we had to walk by a castle and the church, and we just to show you what was happening. We'd walk to school, like past the castle, the tower. And then there was a factory there, a factory that made some kind of medicine. And they had they used licorice roots in that medicine, whether for flavoring or whatever they were doing with it. They'd have the barrels of licorice roots outside, the door to the factory. So we had to walk past the factory. So as we walked past the factory, we all grab a stick of licorice and chew our way down to school, chewing the licorice. And then we went to school. I was in maternelle still, and I don't remember very much of what happened in class, except um, Pétain, since we were children of prisoners of war, made sure that we had hot chocolate maybe once or twice a week. So we'd go to school, and at a certain point, we'd be walk down to the cafeteria or wherever, and we had hot chocolate, a cup of hot chocolate. That's all I remember about the maternelle. But the whole life in the school, and where we were able to walk to school and go places, and that stopped at the time of D-Day.
Can you tell us, before D-Day, you mentioned something about that you were favorites, you and your brother were favorites. What's that story?
I found that out much later, much later than that. I don't know why we were favorite, but I found out after the war, when we visited. Actually, in the 80s, I found out. Oh, we were their favorite, and I didn't feel like their favorite while I was there.
Do you want to tell about?
Well, they had to take care of little kids. I mean, 8 kids. It's like having 8 children, and they, some of them were wild. They had to feed them all. They had to wash their clothes, and washing their clothes and putting the clothes in the washing machine. Especially sheets had to be, so they had to there was a river next to the house, and they had to wash the sheets in the river. When I was young, I used to accompany them at the river because they were taking care of me, and so I played in the water. They had a stone that they washed the sheets out, they soaped them up, and they throw them in. And I used to play with the leeches that would come up, and they would come up, and maybe tadpoles, while they were washing the sheets. And then another things they did for the sheet, they had this like a basin, kind of a barrel, a metal barrel, and they would percolate the sheets. They would heat them in water. They were in boiling water. They had a tub, and that had sort of a percolator, and they washed. After they washed the sheet, they would boil them. So so that was pretty much, and then dinner was a real problem, because they had mostly root vegetables, all kinds of root vegetables. That was what mainly was available. The father, the old man who took care of us, worked in a farm, so we would bring back milk and probably eggs. But we had our own eggs. We had chickens, and then they supplemented with the rations from the kids. So they cooked a lot with root vegetables, and they liked it. But a 4-year-old eating salsify or rutabagas, like soup, rutabaga soup, pumpkin soup. And so I would eat very slowly, like, and so they got mad at me, for eating so slowly, and then they would take my whole meal and dump it in my soup. So I had to eat my soup, and that came along with a slap in the face. So every night there would be this scene, but that's what they did. I mean, but I didn't like it, and I thought I would like to be with my mother rather than this. But they thought that for some reason that we were one of their favorite. I guess the others were pretty bad.
Was there any affection for the children, like from anyone? Anybody hug the kids or tell them
No,
stories or make them feel better? Or
I don't remember that. We got most of our support from the other kids because they were in different ages. We were the youngest. Maybe that's why we were the favorite. Um, and we got, like I remember with me, there was one older girl. She was maybe 14, 15, towards the end of the time. And the pictures that I have of her, she's always holding me or has her hand on me. And so I thought that maybe, like the other kids would. I know my brother sort of thought he was my father, he was at least protective of me. He was much better than my father. Anyway, so that's the kind of. I don't remember having a birthday party. I don't remember. Occasionally, we would get a toy, some kind of a toy, um, but that's about it.
did they have you? Did they have you celebrate Christmas at all?
Oh yeah, I mean the priest in town who was sympathetic. Like in many of these stories of children who are taking care in these villages, the priests would try to convert the kids. This priest, like made us. We participated in children's activity in the church, gymnastics and other things, and we the Trouves, that's the people who took care of us, were not particularly religious. They, there was a caste system, and they were sort of considered lower caste because they were caretakers, and they took just their name, Trouvé, means found. So it's like calling a family foundlings, So you can imagine at one point in their history, they may have been orphans. So they weren't that religious, and they were religious in a cultural way, in a way. And occasionally they would go to church, and then when they went to church, we went to church. I remember Christmas night services in the cold church, and the priest knew that we were Jewish, and nothing, no. Even though we participated in all the activities, they never mentioned any time. And then the kids would tell me about the religion, about hell, and about all that thing. I would never join that religion for whatever whatever cause, because. But we were never proselytized or made to feel like we had to do it.
Do you know if the people who took care of you were subsidized to take care of you?
I think somewhat. Maybe my mother also paid them. I think the government may have paid something, and the rations. We had rations, so they probably. And then the husband worked. I'm sure he wasn't making a lot of money, and so that may have been an incentive. They weren't doing it out of the kindness of their heart, they just had a big house and they could do it, and they probably paid to do it. That's why, in the sense that I really, people were asking me why I didn't recommend them to Yad Vashem or any of these things. I think they're a little reluctant to do it for people who were paid for doing it. So I didn't push it in that way. But I made sure that at that celebration they were recognized for doing that thing, and up to that time they were not recognized. They wouldn't even let him live in town. Like the daughter and her husband, who was a prisoner of war, um, wanted to get housing in Udon, and the town wouldn't help them. So the people that helped were not particularly praised, after the war. So when they had that celebration in the Mary, I'm sure they recognized the daughter, and they gave her insignia, that I told them. And then there were other people there who had lived in Udon and had helped soldiers, American soldiers and British soldiers hide out and all that. So they were recognized also. But I made sure that she was recognized, and it wasn't part of the plan.
Very nice.
But
So,
they did it.
so how did life proceed from there?
Well, the real difference was D-Day, the D-Day time. Now, I'll tell you a little story before D-Day, because I think it's relevant to your story. At a certain point, when we were living in Udon, my cousins from Paris, he was 19, and she was, they were brother and sister, and she was 15 or 16, maybe 15 or 16. They asked to be, they asked to live in Udon, in our house. And they weren't supposed to be there. And if they had been discovered, they would have been, the Trouvé would have been in trouble. So for a while, they were living there. They were helping around the house. He was helping, and she was helping with the kitchen, helping with the kids and all that. So at a certain point, the relatives of the Trouvés, they had relatives that lived in Dreux, which is the next town over, kept harping on them that it was dangerous to have these people here. They could round up everybody if they ever found out, not knowing that we were somewhat protected by the priest and by the mayor. They were worried, and they kept harping on them. So at a certain point, the Trouvés thought they would have to turn my cousins over. And a neighbor across the way found out about it and told them to get out of there because they were going to turn them in. This is a French neighbor, somebody who was visiting us, and we knew them. We knew her. It was just a woman. Anyway, so my cousins decided they have to pack their bags and leave. So that night, we're all sleeping. In the middle of the night, we're awakened to the sound of anti-aircraft artillery, but intense. Boom, 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 boom. And the Trouvés took all the kids and woke them up and told them we have to go down to the basement, into the basement. And so on the way out, we pass a window and we look out the window, and it was like daylight. They had sent flares and lit the whole sky was like brighter than daylight. And we looked up and we saw this armada of airplanes, bombers, and heavy bombers, like thousands, hundreds of them, flying, and then the anti-aircraft gun, but they were flying too high, and they weren't necessarily hit. And but this went on the whole night. So when we started looking, and we were so amazed, and we were looking up, and the Trouvé said, "Hurry up!" down, because we thought they were going to bomb us, and they thought afterwards, they thought that maybe they were trying to bomb Chartres, and they mistook us for Chartres, and they were going to bomb us. So then in the morning, people found out that it was D-Day, that the Allies had landed on D-Day, and we thought, we're getting liberated, like June 6th, and getting liberated. And the Trouvé forgot about turning my cousins in. My cousin stayed and waiting for the Allies to come and liberate us. And this was June 6th. They didn't liberate us till August 18th. So what happened after that? The Germans, who were very thinly spread in Normandy and here, started bringing up soldiers to fight in Normandy. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, tanks, trucks, everything started going through our town. And we were in the main road to Normandy, like we're on the border town, like they were coming from there and Paris and going through Normandy. So for a while, there were a lot of Germans in Houdan, and also we never really felt the presence of the Gestapo. Well, now there was Gestapo in Houdan, because at that time, this was June 6, 1944, a lot of the German soldiers were either dead or old, and because they were recruiting soldiers that were over the age or even younger. I have a picture of a German soldier that I got from the National Archive of a soldier they captured in Houdan, and the kid looks like an American teenager, and so all of a sudden Houdan is now. We went to school, normally, because they hadn't arrived yet. They were just arriving, and we're in the recreation. The school, we're playing in a schoolyard, and all of a sudden, this battalion of motorcycles stops at the school, and these soldiers in battle gear, come into the school and start playing with the kids, because they'd been in Russia, or they've been in North Africa or someplace like that. So they see kids and start playing with the kids. And one of them picks up my brother and starts playing with him, in his arms. And I'm looking, I said, what is he going to do? Like, oh my God, but my brother was lucky. He was blonde when he was a kid. So they just put him down. But what it was is that they were closing the school, and they were going to make it the headquarters of the German army station in Houdan. So all of a sudden, the whole town is crawling with Germans in battle gear, and they were going to make our school their headquarters. So we went home, and at the time, since we had a large house, they scouted this place, and they found that this place would be a great place to have not soldiers living there, but a canteen. So soldiers could come and eat their lunch or breakfast and exercise before being sent eventually to fight in Normandy. So this captain comes in, this captain comes in with a bag of what turned out to be coffee. It was about a bag this size, and and he gestures. He doesn't speak French, I guess. He gestures that he wants coffee, and there's the coffee. So my Madame Trouvé goes out and gets a big, coffee boiler, teapot, and puts it on the stove. And he looks at me, he looks at her, and says, mm. He said, and he points to the wash tub, with the percolator. He says he wants that full of water and boiled, and he poured the coffee in there. So all at once, our house is a canteen, and for a while, they marched in the soldiers, and they used our yard for their exercise, and we were supposed to be somewhere else, and they made a mess of the place, and all that. Anyway, these soldiers, we found out later, were coming from Russia. They had been in Russia, and they had no interest in fighting anymore. Like this was like the last part of the Russian campaign. And so they weren't given guns until they were in the front, because they were afraid they were going to shoot their officers. So the only one that had a gun was the captain, and they sometimes they made a joke about Hitler, about marching. They were, and of course they were all interested in kids. Like they had their own kids. One incident, they were all exercising, so they took off their close to the T-shirt. They were wearing this T-shirt, and on their T-shirt was an SS sign. They were an SS troop. I mean, they whatever they thought, they were part of an SS force. So they were exercising, and they did this SS symbol, and I thought it said 44. I didn't know anything about SS. It looked like there was 44. Why all these sorts? They all had the number 44 on it. So I mean, I didn't ask anybody, but that's what I thought. I thought it was a 44. I don't know if you've heard recently, just in the news last week or the week before, the German soccer team got new uniforms, and the new uniforms were in a script that was reminiscent of a modern script. It was reminiscent of some other German script, and one of the players had number 44 on it. and they had to get rid of all the uniforms, because all of a sudden this soccer player was wearing an SS number. So that was funny to me, because I thought it was 44 a long time ago. So I thought it was really funny that, but that's what I thought. And so they stayed for a while, and my cousins were still there. Now you have this 19-year-old Jewish guy living where the Germans are coming in to do their mess and their exercise. Like a whole battalion. So the Trouvé put him in a bedroom on the top floor and told him that he had tuberculosis, and kept in lock. Then Rosette, was young. She was 16, and she had, she spoke French, and they said she was a relative. She was a cousin. So that went on until it was time to go off to Normandy in the front. So the troops were getting ready, and the captain comes in, and he was saying goodbye or whatever he was doing there, but he was interested in my 16-year-old cousin. And he comes in and he puts his hand on his gun and he says, "How come everybody in the family is blonde and you have black hair?" And, he starts questioning. And then one of his adjutants, spoke over and says, "Sir, your car is ready." And then he sort of pulls his hand away and says, "Too bad." Is in French. He says, "Dommage," and left. So that was that experience. And so this must have been July 44. And a lot of them left, but they were still there. They in force, until I would say July, maybe many of them left. And in August, the Germans that were still in town had orders from Hitler to destroy every town, that they were leaving. So they were going to destroy Udon. And what they did is on August 17th, we were near this river, and in the river, over the river on the road, there was a little bridge because it was the main road to town. It was called Rue de Paris, and it had a small bridge. And on this small bridge, they put these little robot tanks full of explosives, and they must have put about 20 of them. And we were watching them all day putting that stuff on, and wondering, where are we going to go? Are we going to go in the back, or are we going to go here? And we kept moving things all day from one place to the other. And then finally they decided that we're going to go into the basement, what they call the cave, where they kept all the potatoes I hated. And anyway, they said that we're going to be there. And okay, so the night came, and we had to go to bed. So we all went down to the cave and waited. And the adults had shovels, because you can imagine, like, we were right next to the bridge. Like, we were the first house next to the bridge, and they were putting up. And I have pictures from the American archives of what the explosive looked like. One of them, and they had put like 20 of them, maybe. So the morning, like, it's quiet. It's all quiet. The adults are there with their shovels. And the kids, they were there, wonder what happened. And I asked my brother, "Are we dead?" So no one said anything, just waited, and nothing had happened. What happened was that one of the resistance cut the wires. There were red and blue wires coming out of town, and he cut the wires. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about him. His name was Lerasle. I think it's spelled Lerasle. Lerasle. And he was a hunter. And he was allowed to carry a gun and free to go, hunt. And we raised rabbits. Whenever we had rabbit eaten, we have a pelt, and he would collect pelts. So you sort of wonder, I until recently, I wonder, what was he able to move around town with a gun with all these Germans there and hunt? So what I realize is that it was the fur coats for the German army in Russia. They needed pelts. They needed fur. That's why my uncle, probably in Paris, was a furrier. He was a defense industry. So Laurel became a defense industry. So he was a resistor. So he was free to walk around and go all over the countryside, and he probably had a pass, and they left him alone. So he was able to communicate with all the resistors and all the things like that. So that night they knew exactly what was going to happen, and he was able to go into a basement in the house next to ours and cut the wires. So in the next morning, nothing happened. And then in the morning, we see a Jeep. We don't know what was a Jeep, with some of the resistors in it and this soldier. And they look at what's happening with the bridge, and then they turn around and go back. It was the road, the main road out of Houdan. And so about an hour later, we see in the distance this tank columns, slowly moving. And we said to ourselves, like tanks don't move slowly in our town, they're usually going somewhere. And so they're coming down, and as they get over to the bridge, we see that all this stuff is coming out of the tanks: cigarettes, chewing gum, tobacco, cheese, lifesavers, chewing gum. That was it. Anyway, they were liberating the town, but also they were going to do a major battle in Mantes, right across the Seine, and Patton was in charge. And at one point, Patton came to Houdan, because I know, because I went to Washington and looked at the records of the troops that were in Houdan, and I got the notebook of the commander. And in the notebook of the commander, he says, "Oh, today we had an interesting case. General Patton came to visit us." Well, General Patton came to visit because the next day they had a major battle crossing the Seine, and this was something that Eisenhower at first and the other generals didn't want to do, because they were pressured by de Gaulle to liberate Paris. And Patton didn't want to liberate Paris because he says it doesn't have any military value. What he wanted to do was cross the Seine so the Germans wouldn't set up a line, to make it more difficult to cross the Seine. This I learned afterwards. At the time, I didn't know. All I knew is that they were throwing candy and throwing cheese, and they tried, and chewing gum was something new. No one ever experienced. So at first we were collecting all the candy, but then we realized that if we collected the cigarettes, we could trade with the adults for all the candy that they had collected. Anyway, but this was over. I mean, the Americans came, and the war was over for us. That was it. And but the war wasn't over for the Americans. That's why Patton wanted to go across the Seine, because they were still fighting the war, and there was no time for parades. I mean, the troops that were in Houdan were the major force that Patton was using, and they went all the way to the Bulge, and a lot of them got killed at the Bulge. The ones that were in Houdan. So it was war for them, like they. The reason I know is that part of the notebook of the commander, in every page was like a different day, and every day he wrote down the number of people that were killed, so that all the way to the Bulge, you got the count of all the soldiers that were wounded and killed, They gave me a chill to know, what was going on, because I saw the whole battle plan of how they liberated Houdan. It was the main force of Patton that went through.
How was life for you during this period and
well,
after?
During this period, afterwards, the town was pretty much free to, and then people started walking down roads and gleaning wheat and you know so it really became not normal. It became different. It became something new that people went swimming. People, it was like a whole new thing, that nobody had experienced before. And so it was kind of nice. But my father was still a prisoner of war, and my mother and my grandmother and my aunt came and visit us. So I have pictures of them coming and visiting us. And so, it was a new normal. Um, and then the only thing left at that point was my father to return. He was liberated June 4th, 1945, in
Salzburg?
huh?
Salzburg or
Salzburg, yeah. In Salzburg, he was liberated in Salzburg, and came on cattle car, which I'm sure was like the same cattle cars that took the people to concentration camps. But anyway, they got all the soldiers on there, but the door wasn't shut. The door was open, and my people took pictures of my father in those cars. And then my mother used to visit us often at that time. And this was something like maybe late June 45. And my mother comes out. She had been hitchhiking. She was still hitchhiking. And she comes, and there's this man with her. I have no idea who this man was. And then they both come in to the house, and that was my father. I cry when I when I keep telling that story. It was very moving because I know he existed. Because my mother would bring pictures of him, and but he left before I was one, and I hadn't seen all that time, and I certainly didn't know who he was. So
how was that reunion?
Well, at first it was good. It was fine. My father was happy to be out and to see us, and came to visit us. He I think he was scarred. My father had to start life over again many times. And he started in Poland, then he started in France, then he started going to the war, then he came back from the war, then he went to America. But when he came back from the war, I didn't realize. Maybe now thinking about it, because they didn't come back and take us back to Paris. My mother made sure that he would come back, and so we stayed in Houdan until 1946, until the end of 1946. So I guess my mother would have time to get back, and my father would get back on his feet. So by the time I got to Paris, they were pretty well set. He was working, and my mother was not working. Was still taking care of the house. Because in France, this class of women, working class women, feeding the family was a full day's work. If you wanted milk, you had to go to the milk store. If you wanted meat, you had to go to the meat store. And then there were rations, and then you had to wait in line. Like just to get bread, you had to wait in line. I know because they sent me to get bread all the time, and I had to wait in line for the bread. And so, and then to heat the apartment, we had to get coal. So we had to go down to the coal store. So, and my mother had a heart condition, and she had rheumatic heart, and did all this stuff with the rheumatic heart. And so she had to climb 6 flights of stairs with the groceries, wherever she went shopping. So, it was a whole day thing. Then after about a year or a year and a half, we moved to another place, not in Paris, but outside of Paris. So we must have been in Paris for 2 years, and then another place for another year. And so we stayed in Paris 3 years, not because my parents wanted to stay in Paris 3 years. You got to remember there's all this thing that happened, and people were beginning to find out about it, and so it was. And we had these uncles in the U.S. that had come in 1905. In the U.S., uncles of my father, and they wanted us to come back there. They didn't know what the situation was. They thought that we'd be safer in the U.S. But my father was born in Poland. My mother was French. If we went to U.S. on my mother's visa, we would have just gone there. Like there was no quota for French citizens. But the Polish citizen had to wait 3 years to. So by that time, my father was really wondering whether we should come here at all, and and he, and some of the relatives in France wanted to set him up in business and help him out, and he had to make a decision, and he decided that for us, my brother and I, it probably was better to be in the U.S. He didn't ask me if it was. Anyway, I came to, at first I thought it was interesting. It was like an adventure, going on a ship and then coming to the U.S. But I found when I was in the U.S. for a while that it wasn't that simple, and coming to the U.S. it was something more interesting. So eventually I became an American and was not a Frenchman anymore.
What did you notice when you first arrived?
Well, if you see the pictures of when I first arrived in France, children my age, 11 years old, still wore short pants. We wore short pants till we were 16, and so my father made sure that somebody made me a suit. He got me I got a custom made suit, to come to America, and it had knickers and high shoes, like like work shoes, So we come to America, and the relatives meet us at the boat, and my cousin, who I had actually met in Paris because he was in the American Army. He was in the dental corps, and he had been in the American Army. And he had visited us when we were in France. He looked at us, looked at me coming in my knickers, and he says, you're not going to make it like this in Brooklyn. So that was the first thing they did. They took me to a store and got me long pants. And I thought, this is for my brother, So that was the first shock. And then there were many, many more. And they got shocked too, because the first thing they did when we arrived is took us to a restaurant and we had steak. So in France, people eat steak with butter. They put butter on steak. So my uncles were Orthodox, and not ultra-Orthodox, they were Orthodox. So my brother goes to the restaurant and he puts butter on the steak. and they were all horrified. So anyway, but it was strange because no, we were not only Jewish, but we had to be Orthodox Jewish, you know. So that was a whole other story that we had to find out. In France, after the war, we learned what it was to be Jewish. Um, the French had Boy Scouts of various religions. Like there were 4 Boy Scouts. There were the Jewish Boy Scouts. They were called Éclaireurs Israélites. They had the Protestant Boy Scouts, and they had the Catholic Boy Scouts. Three Boy Scouts, and the Catholics were only Catholic. The Jewish were only Jewish, but the Protestants accepted anybody. So we went to the somebody, in the family recommended that we should join the Jewish Boy Scouts. So we joined the Jewish Boy Scout, and the Jewish Boy Scout at that time had been part of the resistance in Paris. Many of them had been messengers, carrying messages from one place to the other. So they had this experience, and what they felt was that after the war, they would gather all the Jewish children that had survived and take them into the troop and teach them about Judaism, Jewish light. It was. So I was in the Cub Scout. My brother was in the Boy Scouts, and we got the information of what Jews were like. And I think this is probably the first time we went to a synagogue. It's probably the first time that we knew anything about what it was, because we spent 5 years denying that we were Jewish. So then all of a sudden we're Jewish, but it wasn't Jewish like my Orthodox relatives in the U.S. in Brooklyn. So that was another learning process. Anyway.
Did you want to take a break before you talk about America, or did you want to keep going?
I just want a glass of water. That's all. You're lucky I've thought about this for 20 years at least, if not more, like 40 years.
It's fantastic. All you're remembering.
Yeah. I remembered plus some, so it's more than just remembering. Like my work is about memory, and I know that memory experience is very limited. Like if you're experiencing something, like even today, what do you know what happened in Europe or in Israel and or in Russia and all that? You don't know all that stuff. I mean, how do you find out? You find out by reading papers, listening to the radio. Well, during the war, there were no papers to read if the papers didn't tell you what was happening. And then there was no radio, like occasionally at night when no one was listening, we turn on the BBC and we hear news from the BBC. But no one, and certainly no one knew about camps and like the way I found out about, or the way I realized, I found out after the war, but the way I realized what happened is on my weekly trips around Paris. I'm walking down the street on the Faubourg Saint-Antoine near my house. I'm walking and I come across this photo display. There's like a photo display in the street, large photos, and all these bodies, like I'm wondering, I'm looking at all these bodies, I look at all five, and then all of a sudden it dawned on me that I could have been one of these bodies, I was 10 or maybe not. I was 8 years old, and I realized that, oh, wow. Then I understood a little bit more. Then the news and what adults were talking about and what was happening, what seemed to be more meaningful, but not completely. Like there was so much information that I hadn't been aware of, and everybody thought that I was lucky and that I shouldn't worry about all these things and start doing things. Um, so I had a good time. I had a good time because I felt pretty free to walk around and do whatever I want. Um, but it had to come. It's still coming. Those stories still come.
So you're in America. Yeah.
Let's
Sorry.
pause for 1 second.
Okay, let's take a break. Okay, so we're back from a break, and you have just arrived in the United States, and you're dealing with that and the changes to your system, so that are happening, the new realizations or learning process. Can you tell us more about that?
When you're a kid, you're still pretty positive and happy at first. Then you realize you're not in Kansas anymore. And then you're in some new place. You don't speak the language. You don't understand anything anybody says, and you don't even know Yiddish, so you don't know what they're saying. So you first have to learn the language. One thing that I find, the food, there's so much more food than there was in France, even after the war. I had a particularly liked bananas and sour cream. And I had an aunt, one of my father's aunts, my grand aunt, who loved to give me whatever I wanted, So I gained a lot of weight all of a sudden from that, the portions, everything big. So I became slightly overweight. When I was in France, or when I first came to the U.S., I was really a skinny kid. I mean, I'd been a skinny kid all my life. And when I came here, some of the people thought I'd been in a concentration camp, because I was skinny. And then they all tried to feed me, and they overdid it. And I had a problem for about 20 years or more. Anyway, so, it took an adjustment. And I learned to speak English because they registered me in a school right away. And the students there started showing me all the different things. The first words I learned was street, gutter, sidewalk, So this is the gutter, this is the sidewalk. And within a year, I spoke fluently, and I didn't have any English lessons, except just, and then also that's why I did more art, because I couldn't make myself understood with English, and I didn't really understand a lot of things. So I would do a lot of art, I would draw, and the things I drew was about the war. I mean, like airplanes and kids still do that, but I did it too. And cowboys. That's what I thought when I came to the U.S. I thought that as soon as I landed off the boat, all these cowboys and Indians would be, going around shooting at each other or whatever. And so I soon learned that wasn't it. And I didn't see an Indian. I never saw an Indian for about 20 years. Then I was on the bus. I was going to California after I graduated. I was in my 20s. And the bus from New York to California stops in Albuquerque or Tucumcari, New Mexico. And it's nighttime, and they put us up at the station, and I see an Indian sitting in the chair, and he's reading a newspaper, and turned out to be in the New York Times. So my first Indian was a person reading the New York Times. Well,
That's great.
I still drew cowboys and Indians.
Oh, that's great. So, what was the trajectory of your life
It was
in the
it
United
was
States?
a lot of it in the beginning was getting to know what's going on, and after a year in school, I had to take tests, for that certain level, IQ tests. They started giving IQ tests around 11 or so. So I'm taking an IQ test and I don't even know the language. So they thought I was slow, like throughout throughout high school. I had to, they attract people. So I was placed in the lower grades, and I was um, when I went to a high school, I was placed in the like a vocational track, and they had a track which was the specialist classes. So I couldn't get into the special classes. I didn't have the IQ. That IQ followed me, forever. Anyway, so I some classes I didn't like learning English, and so I didn't do well in English, necessarily. But then I was good in math. Math I didn't have to be know the language, and I was good in math. So my parents would come on open school night, and one class I was terrible, terrible. In the other class I was the best student in the class, and they were used to that already because it happened the same thing in France. The part of my education wasn't was stunted, and then my other education was fine. The things that dealt with math. So, so I had to get back public school in New York, New Utrecht High School in Brooklyn, and when it came time to graduate, um, I I wanted to be an engineer because my brother had gone to engineering school at NYU, and I wanted to be an engineer. So I applied to NYU, and in my teens, I was interested in science. I would keep a notebook with all these inventions I was making. Some of them were pretty interesting. Some of them, were totally out of. But I kept this notebook of all my inventions. So I went to NYU, and for the interview, and I showed him my book of inventions and all that. And I didn't have the grades on all and everything to get into NYU. So he told me, well, you didn't have trigonometry, and you have to have trigonometry. So um, go back to school, take a semester of trigonometry, whatever that region test at the end of each class. So whatever region's grade is, that's what your grade in trigonometry is, and we'll see if we'll accept you. So I went into back to the high school, and I asked to get into the trig class. Now, the trig class was a combined class with geometry that only the special classes would take. So I couldn't take a special class because of my IQ. So I had to learn trigonometry on my own. So I learned trigonometry on my own. Once or twice a week, I would sit in the math office and learn trigonometry. And I did it on my own mostly. Occasionally, the head of the department would come and said, "Do you need any help?" And I didn't need any help because it was a lot of it was visual, a lot of it, so I didn't need that. So then I took the region, and I got 100 on it. So So they took me in NYU. Not only that, out of the Utrecht class, they I also applied to engineering school at City College, and they give a test to get into City College. Everybody takes a test to get into the engineering school. So I take the test, and I guess I didn't do too well on the English part, but I really did outstanding on the conceptual and mathematical, and so I was the only person in New Utrecht to get into City College Engineering School. The But I wasn't as good as my brother. My brother was in the U.S. for, I don't know, a couple of years, and he was the salutatorian of his high school. I mean, he had learned English before he came here. He was a exceptional student, and he had learned English well before coming. So that was the story of the school, So I became an engineering student.
And then, did you become an engineer, or what happened after that?
No, what happened after that is that I always painted, and actually, I not only did very well at NYU, and NYU Uptown, the engineering school at that time. I hate to talk about this. It's like I'm blowing my horn.
Tell us.
No, because the NYU had people from Brooklyn Tech, which were all special school, Bronx High School, Brooklyn Tech, and Stuyvesant. So many of the students, not all of them, like me, but they were all from that. And so I got into a group on my dorm room. They're all from that area. So they studied all the time. I never studied in my life. So they studied every minute from those schools, the special school. So I went along with them. We used to cross the George Washington Bridge to New Jersey studying chemistry, and then walking back studying math. So I did it. I did it with the thing. So by the time I finished the year, and they posted the grades and all that, I was sixth in my class. Like there were only 5 kids smarter than I was. So I thought I would get a scholarship to stay at NYU. And just about that time, my father buys a chicken farm in New Jersey. So I try to get a scholarship, and I can't get a scholarship because my father bought a chicken farm, and he should have been paying my college. So then I had to transfer to Rutgers in New Jersey because this chicken farm was in New Jersey, and the tuition was in-state tuition, and then I switched to physics because I was more interested in. I wasn't made to be an engineer. My temperament was not engineering. I was too independent and didn't like to. I have a very short attention span. So I switched to physics, and then I told the story about I did paintings, and one of my friends was an art major, and told Alan Capro, who was the major figure at Rutgers Art, to come and see my work. And I showed him my paintings, and he sat down and he looked at me and he said, "Phil, you're not a physicist, you're an artist." So I graduated and became an artist. I went to New York and became an artist, lived in a loft.
And who were your contemporaries that were associated with Rutgers?
Well, before Rutgers, there was a whole group of they were either faculty or students ahead of me, and many of them became well known. George Siegel, Uh, there was Alan Capro. Alan Capro developed happenings, and then there was George Siegel with his sculpture, and one day he sculpted us both. And then there was uh, um, Lucas Samaras, who just died. There was a big spread in the New York Times about him. And so Lucas Samaras was a year ahead of me at Rutgers. And then there was another one who just died too. His name was Bob Whitman. He was involved with happenings there. And then Roy Lichtenstein came later. And there were others like Jeff Hendricks, who's less well known, but and Bob Watts is pretty well known. But he developed. He was one of the artists that developed Fluxus. Fluxus is an international movement now of people doing happenings and events and other things like that. And Rutgers was one of the first Fluxus movements, and Bob Watts was a major figure in that. So he's well known. All these people, like you Google Robert Watts artist, and you'll get the whole. And then Capro certainly is in there. So I landed in. I was interested in art. I landed in the hornet's nest. It was very. For me, it's very funny. I'm born, and all of a sudden there's a war. Then I go to America, and I land in Brooklyn. And at that time in the 50s in Brooklyn, it was like a renaissance. Like all the people that came out of Brooklyn and became well known on every field, every major field. And then I come to Rutgers, and then all of a sudden it's the center of the world in contemporary art. So I feel that right now I'm fine. Nothing's happening.
And so where did your life go from there?
Then I did what every college graduate in the 60s does, is marry someone. And I married a woman, a girlfriend, who thought I was a physicist. And then she's married to an artist, and that didn't work out very well. So we moved to a loft, and I don't think that was her idea of what life was going to be like. And so we divorced. We had a child. And
what was her name and what your child's name?
Alex. And her name was Brenda Zeider. But I don't think that's what you shouldn't mention. All right, never mind. Anyway, she's innocent. Anyway, so I hung around New York, and at one point I went to California, and I met Joyce, and then I came back to New York, and eventually she came to New York. Her brother was here, and she was planning to go to New York, but not that time. She was going to go later, and she came in. Then we lived in the loft, and we got married, and then we had 2 children. And I was an artist. And I had some success as an artist in New York. Andy Warhol said that everybody should have 15 minutes of fame. Well, while I was in New York, I had my 15 minutes of fame. And then I spent the rest of my life trying to get another 15 minutes. And then finally, a year ago, my print was in the Met, and I got my second 15 minutes. So,
and tell us about that. What got into the Met? What was your piece?
The Met was 3 prints that pictured the ship, the Ile-de-France, that my family, my father, mother, and brother came to the United States in 1949, in December of 1949. And um, the print is really a result of all the stuff that I did in my art um, from the time that I started dealing with the Second World War and being Jewish and the Second World War and all that stuff. So a lot of the techniques and a lot of ideas and there's a lot of work, a lot of preliminary before I got to that stage. So it incorporates some of the elements of that. But the print was really done in the first one. The first print was the middle of the ship, and I did that in 1990. And the front of the back I did in 2000. So they're like 10-year difference from the front and the back and the middle. And there's reasons for that, but you don't need to know at this point. It was the front and the back were done because of a National Endowment on the Arts grant to do 2 prints.
And so that's wonderful. It went into the Met, and then you have a painting back here that shows France on one side and America on the other. What does that represent? What is that part of your life? What have you been learning about yourself?
The like you don't do large paintings, out of the blue. Like you may do little paintings out of the blue, but it takes a lot of especially if you're trying to do something new. So it takes a lot of preliminary work, So I had to do all kinds of technique before I even attempted one large work. So at that time, I started like in '79 thinking about it in my work, and I think the first large painting that I did was in 1992. So I had to learn a lot of things about. So my paintings, the large paintings, had 3 elements. I've written a book about that. It's not a book; it's a booklet. There are 3 elements. There's my family, and then there's the war, and then there's art, because art is self-expression. Everybody tells you that, art is self-expression. Well, if you're an artist and self-expression, a lot of the self-expression has to do with art. So all the ship has things about my family. It has things about the war and politics, and it has things about artists. All of them do. So this one is just part of that in a different shape. That it's about artists, it's about art, it's about family, and it's about politics. And so that's the basic structure of the thing. The way it's represented is in different ways. I use all kinds of information, photographs. My father's prisoner photographs is a major element in many of my work. I don't think it's. I think it is in there. It's one of the things that floating outside. But I've used all these things in some way in my work. But you have to have a structure like that, otherwise you can't do like 7 major large painting without some kind of basis, to do the composition. And each one introduces new elements, but the basic things are always there. Like, what am I going to do next? Well, I search either I'm going to do art, I'm going to do politics, or I'm going to do family, and then it takes different form. So
And
that's basically what.
Oh, neat. And do you want to tell us about your teaching?
My teaching was terrible. Part of the problem, I have given too many stories. Part of the problem is that I never went to art school. So here I'm teaching, but first I started teaching not in an art school. I started teaching an art program in a BA. So what I was teaching them is how to be an artist, because a lot of people taking art courses in the BA program don't do it for any kind of vocational thing, like, so many of them were going to be artists, or interested in being artists, or interested at least in being like an artist. So that was easy for me. I would tell them how to do it, I would give it from my own experience. Then Rutgers became an art school. The art departments got together and became an art school. Then people coming in wanting to be artists and wanted to learn about art. So I knew about art. I knew enough about art to do it, but I still was teaching how to be an artist, to most of them, and a lot of them became artists. One of them became very well known. I mean, but I will tell you. That's another story, and you've had too many stories. Right?
Do we know who this person is?
I'd rather not say.
Okay.
It's I don't think it's relevant, but every teacher, every professor in the university has somebody that they can point to as being influenced by them.
And
I'll tell you.
Yeah.
Like,
okay. And have you ever been back to France, and what was that like?
I was back to France when I graduated college with my wife, my then wife. And we were planning to stay in France for a year. I was going to paint or work on art. And I don't know what she was going to do, but it wasn't that well planned. But we were thinking of doing it. And then we realized that it would be extremely difficult to stay in France, and I couldn't get a job because my French is already too old-fashioned, for France, and I'd forgotten a lot of it, and she wasn't going to work because she couldn't work. So anyway, we came back, and that was it for 18 years. Then 18 years later, Joyce and I, in 1979, went back during a spring break. And I showed her around, and we went to Udon.
How was that? How did you feel about that? Anything interesting?
I don't have any bad feeling about Udon. And I still don't. I mean, I don't have bad feelings about the Trouvé. I've forgotten about all the dinners. Frenchmen don't forget about dinners. Like usually they talk about their last dinner, but I forgot all about them. And so it was kind of an interesting, pleasant place to see things that changed. One of the things that we noticed that changed is that a lot of people that were there during the war were not there anymore. That France, like in France, the people who own land lived there since the Middle Ages. They never lost but the tradespeople, as a rule, travel. That means they do what they call journeyman. What they mean by journeyman, they go to different towns and learn different trades. And they're usually young people, men and women, going to learn this from this town, learn this from that town. So in the process, they meet somebody in that town, and they get married, and they set up shop in that town. And it continues that people, when they get older and retire, they sell their business. And usually they sell business to somebody who's young, who wants to start somewhere. So there's a lot of movement. Some people are still there, but the next time we went in 1988, nobody was here from that time. Very few people.
Can you tell us about when you met with the daughter from your house that you grew up in?
I don't think we corresponded very much before that. When we came to France in 1988, we rented an apartment. We were going to stay there for sabbaticals, 6 months, Um, and we rented an apartment in the 11th arrondissement, just a few blocks from where I lived and a few blocks from where I was born. Um, so we got in touch with the people there, with Andre, and we knew, and we invited them to there, and then they invited us to their house in I forget the name of the town, but it was outside Paris. And so, we reconnected, and every year we kept in touch. And I met their children. At least I met one of their children, and one of their children was interested in art, so we got along well. And so we corresponded, and whenever we went to France, we tried to see them or try. We I went to France once, and the son came and visited us. And when Andre died, the other children didn't want to have anything to do with us. They didn't want us to correspond with them. And I got the feeling, not now, but I got the feeling that it was something about anti-Semitism. That somehow, like there was the part of the family that thought that they shouldn't be doing this, And I don't think that those people are from that time. They were her children, some adult children. The son was fine with me. I mean, there was no problem. So it wasn't coming from the mother. And so I don't know. Some people marry people and have different ideas. But we were surprised because we weren't corresponding that much with them, And but the fact that don't send us any more letters,
Oh, and that's the descendants of the daughter of the Trouvets?
Yeah, and the Trouvets lived in Houdan and are buried in Houdan. They stayed there. But Andre wanted to stay there, and the town didn't help them at all.
And you said you arranged that family to be recognized somehow?
Just in the town, like we were there for the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Houdan. And there were very few people there that were there when Houdan was liberated, So we were. This is how we were invited. I was having a show in New York, and it was on a gallery near Soho, on Broadway. And my cousin, one of my French cousin, was in New York, or recommended that this person who was a councilman from Houdan to visit the show. So here he is. I'm talking about this was the opening. I'm talking to a lot of people about the work, how the work works, about Houdan and all that. And he's completely flabbergasted that I'm talking about Houdan on Broadway. He didn't know that Broadway is like 40 miles long, and that Broadway is like on 52nd Street, and here we are below 4th Street, So he goes back to Houdan. He says, "This is this painter, and he's doing these paintings, and it's about Houdan during the war, and it's on Broadway." So anyway, the town managed to pay for our coming, and I had a show there. I brought some paintings in the tube, rolled up, and I gave them, one of them, a boat, the boat, so at that ceremony they had some people from the town, especially like two women who had been a real hero, because they hid a lot of the Allied airmen that had been downed and had to be transferred out and stay in safe places. So they were one of the safe places, and so they were celebrating them. And this they were doing this the same time the Trouvé were doing this, when there were Germans crawling all over the place. And they had a big house because they were pretty wealthy, and they had German officers staying in their house, and they had a British airman working in the yard, and they had to tell him to not to that he was deaf, he was deaf mute, so that he would just go around, clean up things, and act like a deaf mute. He, that didn't want to bother with anybody. So that was that. And then they had to go, to the front, so they weren't staying in Houdan, living in houses. So she was there, and they were saying goodbye, and the officer wanted some buttons stashed, some of the fixed. She wanted somebody to fix his button, to put a button on where he was. So she decides she's going to do it. She's going to, oh, sure, she said, and she sewed the button, and she sewed his shirt with it. And she says, you may lose the button, but you're not going to lose your jacket, your coat. In French, but she thought of it. She didn't say it. She thought of it.
And so you had the Trouvés memorialized in some way?
Yeah,
they were being ignored.
So there was a celebration, and they were recognizing people, and she wasn't included because I had invited her to that, because they didn't think that saving Jewish children was something that should be recognized. And also, since they not only saved them, they saved my cousins who were older and putting their life at risk. And the priest was putting his life at risk. He was arrested towards the end of the war and held for a while and then released. But the priest, his name was Pierre Condé, became the Archbishop of Versailles after the war. So he was really recognized because he supported the resistance, and so he was celebrated. So they were celebrating all the people that had done these things, and then I got up and I said, you should also celebrate Madame Trouvé, or Madame. She had a different name at that time, and she saved. She hid us, and maybe hid other. And then certainly hid my cousin, and at the risk of their lives, and so they did. They, belatedly, and she was a bit angry at it because they never helped her. They never recognized her during that time as doing something, because they didn't think of it, and they didn't think that was. And then new people came in, and that was that. One thing I want to say is about Laurent. He's the one who cut the wires, the hunter with the rabbits. So, and the opera there's an opera that my sister-in-law wrote along with a musician. Features that whole thing of cutting the wires and saving the town, actually.
Do you want to tell us about that, the name of it, and who wrote it and what it's about?
Her name is Susan Fox, and the musician is Joel Mandelbaum, and they were both on the faculty of Queens College in New York. And my brother was at Queens College in New York too, teaching physics. And it was really Susan's idea, because she had heard all the stories from my brother, and she decided she's teaching poetry. She was a poet, and she wrote the libretto for this opera that featured my mother and my brother and the resistance and everything, and it's called The Village. And it was performed last year in Hamburg, by a opera company in Hamburg. And I think there's a tape of it, but we've never seen it. Okay.
Yeah. Is there anything else that comes to your mind about your life that you'd like
There are
to?
too many things, and it's like another 4 hours of stuff.
Oh, yes, your children and grandchildren. You want to just mention anything about them?
Yeah. Um, they're all very nice. Anyway, my brother, who suggested that I get reviewed because he was tired of hearing my story. Anyway, he's a political scientist, and he teaches at Penn, and his specialty is Eastern Europe. So he's gotten a lot of information about our family and Eastern Europe, and he's in charge of the family tree. And so he's learned a lot of things, and he's written quite a bit about it. And that's our oldest son. Joyce is our oldest son. I have an older daughter who lives in California, and she's an interior designer and has 2 children, which I don't have too much contact with because they're in California. My second son is Daniel, who's a lawyer, a corporate lawyer, and he lives right now. He's living in Utah because he worked for a company that was in Utah, and now he's moving back, and he has an apartment in New York. So we'll probably see him more. And he has 3 children. Sam is the oldest and lives in New York, and we see him often. And daughter and a child who's 15 and lives in Utah because he's going to high school, and that's the reason why my son is still in Utah, because he wants his son to finish high school. And Mitchell has 3 children, uh, 2 girls and 1 boy, and the boy is a junior at Penn, and Maya is first year in Penn, and Mika is in high school. And Eve, that's our daughter, lives in New York, and lives in actually Hoboken, right across, works in New York. She's a development person for the American Institute in Rome. She's a fundraiser for that organization, one of the fundraisers, and in charge of events, and has a stepdaughter.
Do you have any thoughts about what the anti-Semitism that's going on today? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's disappointing. Disappointing. You know, America for the longest time was seen really as a haven, at least in part, once they figured it out. Took them a good number of years before they figured out what they could possibly do, you know. And now seeing it sort of splinter off has to be disappointing. But as far as the events in Israel and Gaza, I ever since France and after the war, I was never really involved with Israel. I remember there's a reason. The in part, when I joined the Scouts, the French Scout, I was just learning what Judaism was, and at the time, this was in 48. The Zionist groups in France and other places were trying to recruit Jews to go live and fight in Israel. And they were very forceful. And they were trying to take over the Jewish Boy Scouts and make them into part of the Zionist movement to go into to fight. So actually, a number of the people in the Scouts actually did that with their family. They didn't do it themselves. Like I have a cousin, a close cousin, is a cousin by marriage, but he was in a Boy Scout with me, and we were close. He actually went to Israel with his mother, and in a boat, you know, uh, through the blockades and everything. And he stayed in Israel till a ripe old age. I mean, not ripe, till his 20s, and then came back to France and lived in France the rest of his life. So that experience with the Zionists that particular period of time really put me off, and put a lot of other people off at that point. I never had this feeling that Israel was. I'm sympathetic, but I feel like later on, Joyce and I went to Israel for a tour, and it was a great. I can't think of the name. I'm 85, so immediate memories sometimes. Anyway, it was overseas travel tour, and we went there, and I didn't feel this closeness to it. I felt this was a foreign country, had its own. I had no power in that foreign country. You know, I don't vote there. I hardly vote here. You know, like even when I vote, nothing happens. So I wasn't. I didn't feel like a lot of people, especially people who go to synagogues and really involved with the whole. You know, I'm a secular Jew. I belong to a secular Jewish organization. I did, and you know, the Judaism is a social family issue. You know, I would never deny that I'm Jewish, and it doesn't even make sense to me. You know, I was Jewish when I was born, and I'm still, but I don't have this closeness with Israel. I sympathize with them. But I feel it's a foreign country. You know, there are things that are happening there that I wouldn't do. You know that, I know what it's like because I was there and I saw what it was like, and I have I have other sympathies and other things. So, you know, like I'm not ashamed of it. I think I'm an American. I'm an American Jew, and I do things Jewish. I celebrate Passover, yeah, and it's that's the way I feel about the whole issue, and I think it's a terrible issue on both sides. But I think I've seen it for 80 years, you know, and that hasn't changed. And there's something wrong with these people in 80 years that they couldn't come to some kind of agreement, and they're not going to come in another 80 years, you know, like that. So that's one of the things that I feel. And it's not any disrespect for the people. You know, everybody has a hard time. And but I feel personally it's a struggle that I don't want to participate in.
Thank you. Thank you for everything you've shared with us today. Is there any final thought that you have for us?
I've known about testifying before, and the reason I didn't want to testify is that, you know, I'm here and I'm one of the survivors. Maybe I'm making some progress towards having the past, like my cousin, you know, remembered in some way, in a permanent way, through my work, and I felt that I spent a lot of time doing that. So this is not completely new to me. I have given testimonies in synagogues and about my work and about my and people were asking that my work, you know, when they looked at my work, says, "What's Jewish about your work?" You know, I couldn't explain, so I said, "I'm Jewish." So, but I can, that's what I can say. It's all important. Everybody is doing that because, like, I think like a lot of African Americans are remembering slavery. None of them have been in slavery or enslaved, but it's important to remember all these things, like it's not like you're in a movie and you've come in the middle. I mean, you when you come in a movie in the middle, you don't know what's happening. But I think a lot of people involved in Gaza and all that, they're coming in the middle. They haven't come in the beginning. So I'm not going to tell them what to do, but it's what I'm doing, what other people, all the testimony like that, it's going to last a long time because these things are not over for a long time. And I think what you're doing is very good.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing with us.
Okay.
And that concludes the interview. And who do we have here?
The first picture on the left is my parents' wedding picture. I forget exactly the date. I think it's 32, I think, because my brother was born in 34. The next picture is, I think, a picture of one of my father's brothers who remained in Poland and died, I guess. And the third picture from the left is my father, taken in, I would say, 1939, in his army uniform, French army. He was in the French Foreign Legion, or Legion for Foreigners, and I think he did it to get his papers. And my mother, this is a picture also taken about that time, maybe 1940. And she may have taken that to send to my father in camp.
And can you tell us their names?
Yes. My father's name was Albert. His real name, his given name was Abraham Yitzhak, and he went by Albert in French, Albert. And his name was Orensztajn, Orenstein. And my mother is Sophie Germaine Mines was her main name. And she didn't like Sophie, so she was always called Germaine.
Thank you. And who are we looking at here?
The first picture on the left is a picture of a clothing shop, probably a men's clothing shop, that was owned by the husband of my aunt, my mother's sister, and the person standing on the right is my father, a presser in that shop. And this is where my mother and father met.
And where is it located?
Probably in Paris, in the shop district, like in what is now the Marais, but used to be called St. Paul. And the picture on the right is a picture of our family, just as the day my father went to war, or maybe when he got his first leave. I was barely 1, and my brother was 4, 5. And it's my father and my mother.
Okay, thank you. And who do we see here? And where are they?
The picture on the left is my mother and father and us, just the day that my father came back from that I met my father. And that was probably like July 1945. Yeah, summer 1945.
And what's that location?
This is the bridge that I talked about, where all the explosives were under. They may have still been under at that time, that place. They may not have removed it yet, because maybe they did. It was 1 year after it happened. Then the center picture is our family also, but this was taken in Paris, and probably was 1946 or 47. And the picture on the right is my mother and my father, also in July 1945, when he just came back. And they're near what they call lavoir. And this is where they wash the clothes in the river. And there was a garden there.
Thank you. And what do we see here?
Well, I'm going to start in the middle, second from the right. That's a picture taken of my father in Salzburg, or Salzburg area. It was actually in the mountains, as a prisoner of war. The one next to it on the left is my father's ID picture from camp with his number, holding up his number. And the one on the left above that is the back of many of my childhood pictures. It's the censor stamp from the camp. Everything that comes in and everything that comes out of the camp had to be censored. So there was a stamp, censored is what it says. And it's Stalag 18C. And it was in Salzburg, Austria. The other one, the one on the left, the very left, is a lot of the prisoners from that camp posed. I don't know who took the picture, but it's the camp was mostly for non-coms. So they're non-com. My father said that they were non-com from Yugoslavia, maybe Serbian, because he learned Serbian when he was in prisoner of war. He could speak about 7 languages, and Serbian was one of them. And then on the extreme, on the right, this a lot of the prisoners put on performances and made the scenery and the costume, and I guess they had a place to do that, to put them on. And this was a production of Romeo and Juliet, and both of the actors are prisoners, men.
Thank you. What do we see here?
The picture on the left is my father's French military uniform. About the time that probably joined the war or joined the army. And the picture in the middle is a group of soldiers from his outfit, and he's standing in the back on the left, the very left. And the other picture is really taken when he had become prisoner. I don't think I don't know. I don't think the men are from his outfit.
And what town was that in?
I have no idea. Maybe in Germany somewhere.
Okay, thank you. And who do we see here?
Well, this is a photo taken in Houdan. The one on the left was probably around 1943, 1943 in Houdan. Houdan is a town near Normandy. The center picture is really from after the war. The person who took that picture was a prisoner of war, and his son had been in Houdan. And that's really the family, our family, his family, and the family of the Trouves who were in Houdan. And the other one is also a picture taken about that time, but not by the not by the prisoner who was in the first picture, but it looks like my mother's in there, so it's not my mother. My father's in there, but it's also the families, my family, and the Trouves, and some of the kids from the camp.
And the one on the left, is that the Trouves, the group that you were with at the Trouves?
Yeah, the Trouves.
Okay.
That's about the number of kids that were living in that. It changed because I have other pictures and it changes.
So some kids came and some kids left?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Um,
And who do we see here?
This is our family at a party, at a wedding, I think, just before we went to the U.S. On the left is my brother, who at that time was called Serge, and he hadn't come to America and changed his name yet. Next is my father, Albert. He was still Albert, and my mother, Germaine, and me with the knickers, and I was called Philippe.
And what did Serge change his name to?
Stephen.
Stephen.
He didn't change his name. A cousin changed his name. He said at the time there was a lot of, this was like almost the time of McCarthy era, and there was a lot of Russian, talk about Russia and communism and all that. And my cousin said, Serge is not a good name now. So change it to Stephen.
Interesting. Thank you. And who are these folks?
Well, these are my son's family, Mitchell, who's the tall one, and his wife, Martine, and their 3 children, Maya, who's now a freshman in college, and Mika, who's in high school, and Max, who's a junior in college.
Thank you. And who do we have here?
It's a family group in the synagogue in Philadelphia. The person on the left is Michelle, Daniel's wife. The tall person there is my grandson, Sam. He's Michelle's son. And the boy in the front is Asher, who's Michelle's and Daniel's son. Above him is Alex, who's my daughter from my first marriage. And I think, no. Then next to her is Eve and her stepdaughter Miette and her husband Sean. Joyce, my wife. In the back is my son Daniel, and I'm on the right. I made a mistake. The person above Asher is really Talia. Is my granddaughter Talia. Looks the same. From here,
Great, thank you very much. And this concludes the photo section.